This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on World War II. During the 1920s, the United States banker Charles Dawes developed a solution to international trade. The United States banks would lend money to Germany in order to industrialize. They would then take these payments and they would use them to do repayments of loans between countries, which would encourage economic growth. This would also encourage international trade. When the Great Depression occurred, these banks could no longer do this due to the vulnerabilities of the banking system, causing a collapse of the international markets. Two alternatives arose at this time to challenge capitalism as the Great Depression was taking place: communism and fascism. Communism succeeded in Russia, however, most of Europe rejected it due to atheism, especially Central Europe and Germany. German traditional beliefs and religious faith led to a rejection of communism and an acceptance of fascism. Adolf Hitler preached a return of German nationalism and expansion over Europe. He used Jewish people to blame for the loss of World War I because he claimed that the Jews had run the German government and military during this time period. He failed originally to gain military control when he tried during what was known as the Beer Hall Push, a violent revolution. He was taken into prison, and while he was there, he realized the long-run solution: run for political office and get the democratic vote. Hitler won the chancellor position in Germany. He then used this power to scapegoat Jews and unify the German support. He militarized the economy and dropped unemployment all the way down to 2%. Then he expanded outwards, annexing Australia, invading Czechoslovakia, and eventually taking over Poland. At this point, Britain and France declared war on Germany, but they lost in Germany's invasion of France. Between World War I and World War II, Americans resorted back to the notion of isolationism, and they became pacifist, just as European populations were. For example, they agreed to the Kellogg-Briand Act, which promised not to declare or advance war unless attacked. They also agreed to the Washington Naval Conference, promising to limit the production of naval battleships. However, this just allowed Japan and Germany to become stronger aggressors, and they developed their militaries relative to the size of the US and Britain's lack of development. During this time period, Franklin Delano Roosevelt pursued a foreign trade policy as a way to build international relations and solve the Great Depression. He worked on reciprocal trade agreements with Latin America, which lowered trade tariffs on both sides. He also established the Good Neighbor policy, promising that the U.S. would not pursue colonies overseas. This eventually led, for example, to the independence of the Philippines from the United States. At first, FDR treated the rise of fascism as purely a European problem. For example, during the Spanish Civil War, FDR decided not to interfere, allowing the fascist leader Francisco Franco to call FDR a gentleman. FDR later came to see that fascism was a threat to democracy, free trade, and human rights in Europe. The problem at this point was trying to convince the isolationist American public that the U.S. had to get involved. FDR started to ease America into the war through halfway policies. For example, he established the Lend-Lease. Americans would lend out or lease military weapons to the British. He also established a draft before the beginning of the entrance into the war. And FDR even established a secret voluntary force to enter into the war on the ground. This was released and unveiled 1 week before the major attack at Pearl Harbor, and people were completely outraged that FDR would slowly ease America into this war. Yet 1 week later, when the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor, everyone forgot that original outrage and joined with FDR in trying to defend the nation. The context for the attack on Pearl Harbor is much larger than just the attack. Japan had invaded Manchuria, just north of China, in order to gain control over the Asian region. They established the Asian Co-Prosperity Zone, claiming that they were freeing Asians from Europeans. But the reality was they were establishing a zone in which Japanese imperialism would be allowed to use Koreans, Chinese, and Vietnamese as their own manual slaves. But the Japanese needed oil, and America was the market for their oil for battleships. When America froze the oil supplies in order to try to get Japan to move out of China, that is when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. After the attack at Pearl Harbor, Americans lost battles for 6 months in the Southeast Pacific. For example, they lost the Philippines, and the Japanese took American soldiers who had been captured and marched them 300 miles north to imprisonment camps in the Bataan Death March. American leaders decided that they needed to change strategy and course to turn the war. On the European side, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin agreed to the African strategy. In this strategy, the Allies would attack through northern Africa first, removing the German allies Italy. Then, the Americans and British would attack Germany from the west, while the Soviets would attack from the east. This is really important because it leads to one of the main causes of conflict between Russia and the United States once World War II was done. Joseph Stalin had agreed to this strategy, but he believed this was done to weaken the Soviets by not attacking Germany head-on. This is not true, but Joseph Stalin's paranoia was definitely shown here and would be a long-term problem when the Cold War got started. In the Pacific, Douglas MacArthur, who had lost the Philippines but warned that he would be back, developed the Pacific strategy of island hopping. The idea was that American attacks would be done on satellites of Japan first to cut off their supplies and airlifts. Then the U.S. would eventually attack Japan directly. At home, Roosevelt had to industrialize the economy, and he did so by industrializing the military. The federal government subsidized factories in order to produce military goods. This eventually led to a 1.2% unemployment rate. African Americans and women were attracted into cities and factories, showing a huge shift in demographics on the home front. However, there were a number of major violations of individual minority rights at the time. Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 to intern Japanese during World War II for fear of espionage. Japanese families were not only interned, they lost all of their property, even though many of their sons chose to fight in the U.S. Army. Eventually, this was challenged in court under Korematsu versus the United States, but the Supreme Court upheld the action as a case of national emergency. Franklin Delano Roosevelt also turned away Jewish refugees before the war who had come looking in the United States for asylum on a boat called the St. Louis. American and British forces defeated the German troops in northern Africa. They then removed Italy from the war. At that point, America and Britain invaded through Normandy from the west, while the Soviet Union invaded Germany from the east. This two-front war strategy eventually defeated the Germans. Franklin Delano Roosevelt attended the Yalta Conference that made the final plans for the war in Europe. He then returned home and suffered a stroke and died. His vice president, Harry Truman, took over office and met with Joseph Stalin about the war in Japan. He met at a place called the Potsdam Conference, where Truman was told that the U.S. had finally successfully tested an atomic bomb. Truman decided to use the atomic bomb, claiming that he was ending the war and saving lives. In fact, he claimed that this would save 1 million American lives and even more Japanese lives because we would not have to invade the island. Truman's justification was that the Japanese were simply too loyal to the emperor to end the war without a great shock. His critics would argue that the war would have ended with the Soviet-U.S. cooperation in invading Japan. Also, they argued that Japan wanted a conditional surrender in which they would retain their emperor as a symbolic leader. At the end of the war, the Allies put the German leaders on trial for their crimes against humanity. This was the first time that the globe decided to do this after a war in order to establish an international sense of human rights. The leaders also established the United Nations, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank in order to create a solution to the international problems in the economy during the Great Depression. They created international economic rules that would stop this Great Depression from ever happening again.